Of our SARI events. This is a scholarship and research integrity sponsored event from the Office for Research Protections. And my name is Deb Proveromo. I'm the education coordinator for SARI. So if you have any questions about SARI, you would contact me and I would be able to help you. By swiping in, you receive 1 hour of SARI credit. I know not everybody here was interested in the SARI credit, but by swiping in, you do receive that. And we notify your program administrator and let them know that you attended our event. And so that's how they know to give you credit. Okay, there are some flyers that are on the table about the rest of the events for the semester. This is the first one for the second semester. So we have 11 events scheduled. And then we also have a couple of the CATS IRB sessions that are online. So they're on the back of that flyer if you want information about those. Okay. You need to stay for the entire time, and it's 1 hour in order to receive SARI credit. And as a courtesy to our speaker, if you could set aside your cell phones for the next hour, that would be really appreciated. Today, we are very fortunate to have Sara Horn. She's the director of the IRB program at the Office for Research Protections. I work with Sara, and she leads and manages the day-to-day activities of the IRB program. She serves as a committee member on both IRBs and as a designated reviewer of non-committee new study applications, modifications, and continuing reviews for the use of human participants in research, reportable new information, and non-human research determinations. So our event today is entitled IRB 201, New IRB Requirements for 2018, the Revised Common Rule that I'm sure you're all interested in hearing about. So let me welcome Sara.
Thanks, Deb. So my name is Sara Horn, and as Deb said, I'm the director of our IRB program. I want to start out the session today by just taking a little poll so that I know who my audience is here. So how many of you are here today because you are doing or will be doing research with human subjects that you think might be affected by these particular changes? All right. Okay, good. So we got a couple of you in the audience. So I'm going to talk a little bit first today about the actual dates that are involved in some of these changes, and that is something that has very recently changed, so you'll have to bear with me, and I am not moving through the slides here. And it is on. Sometimes. Give me 1 second here. Let's see now. I hope that at the end of the session, we may have maybe 5-10 minutes left for some of your questions. We also have some potential remote participants, so we'll try to answer any questions that come in that way as well. And I do have my colleague here with me, Jody Matthew. She's also an IRB analyst at the Office of Research Protections, so either of us can field some of your questions at the end should you have them. Try now.
I might just have to.
All right, so we'll just forgo that and we'll do things this way, if we can. Okay, there we go. All right, now we're moving. So a little bit of an overview of what we're going to do today. So today we're going to cover some important dates and some of the unknowns that may still exist related to this common rule change. We're going to talk about what the common rule is and some of the requirements that are changing at a high level. So generally some of the things that are changing, the exemptions, informed consent requirements, continuing review, and cooperative research. We're going to talk about the transition from the old rule to the new rule, if you will. And also I want to touch, if we have some time, on some NIH policy revisions, just so that you're aware and can take that information back to any of your colleagues that you may be working with as well. Can everybody hear me okay, first and foremost? Okay, great. I have a little bit of a cold today, so you have to forgive me if I'm sneezing or coughing. So the first thing we want to talk about is the actual important dates related to this rule. I know some of you may have been coming today thinking, oh my gosh, some of those things I'm going to have to do starting tomorrow. And we have a little bit of breaking news related to this, which I am personally pleased about, which is that we recently had, okay, I don't know what this is. Forgive me. We recently received news, actually yesterday afternoon, while I was in the middle of a meeting talking about some of these things. We received word that the provisions that were supposed to go into place tomorrow, January 19th, have been delayed for 6 months. So what that means is those things that we're talking about today, and that's why we planned this for today, so that we would be able to educate you in a timely manner related to making said changes. However, this being pushed back to July, this is obviously now a preview of what will be happening in July when this rule does go into effect, okay? So this is separate from the single IRB requirement for cooperative research. So I will mention this a little bit later, but we've got 2 things going on right now, and I think there's some things going on with NIH that complicate people's view of these dates and everything. So let me be forward in saying there are some changes that are coming with NIH that are still coming regardless of this delay, and those will go into effect on January 25th of this month, okay? And one of those things is a requirement to rely on a single IRB for multi-site research. There was also a provision in the common rule, the revised common rule that we're going to talk about today, for the single IRB review of cooperative research. That particular provision still goes into effect on January 20th of 2020. So we've got a couple of years before that particular provision goes into place. But again, for multi-site research, single IRB will be required on January 25th of this year. Okay, so what is the common rule? The common rule is a set of regulations that must be applied to human subject research that is federally funded in general. Although Penn State does apply those same standards under our accreditation to, or equivalent standards, to non-federally funded research. So for you, for most of you, things would look seamless whether you were doing a federally funded project or not. Those same requirements would be in place. So this particular revision to the common rule was something that was published in January of 2017. And there was a whole lot of hubbub and a lot of questions going on about whether this rule would move forward, especially under the new presidential administration. Hence that delay that I just mentioned to you at this point of pushing everything back until July. So the changes that we're going to talk about today generally apply to all research at Penn State except for the following types of research. So research that is FDA regulated. So if you know that your studies are FDA regulated, this would not apply. And also to research conducted or funded by Department of Justice. Now, with that 6 month delay, there is always a possibility that these 2 agencies could sign on to this rule in that interim time, and that the research the regulations could then be applicable to that research, but we don't know that yet, and that will remain to be seen. Okay, so let's talk about the key change number 1, some of the expanded exemption categories. So if you're familiar with the way that we process things in our office, most people tend to put things in 3 buckets for IRB review, if you will. And those 3 buckets, people typically think of studies that have been determined to be exempt, are expedited review, or require full committee review, okay? So it's really not my preference to talk about the three buckets because there are really many more than that. So I'm generally going to give you the quick and dirty overview of the path that a submission takes when it enters our office so that you can have that baseline understanding. So when we receive an application through CATS IRB, if you're familiar, if you've done that before, you submit to us and the work that's carried out is carried out by an IRB analyst, just like Jody here, okay? And so that IRB analyst is first looking at that study to determine whether that actually requires any sort of IRB review or determination. There are some things that we receive that don't. So for instance, if you had a study where all you were doing is receiving publicly available data or completely de-identified data, it is possible that that study may not require IRB review because it doesn't meet our definition of human subjects. So we're trying to define or determine whether something meets that definition in order to process that and move that forward. So if we should decide that something is human subject research, we move on to the next step. And that next step would be to determine whether something can be exempt from IRB review, okay? So that's what we call an exemption, and that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about here. So under policy RPO3, which is the use of human participants in research, Penn State's general policy, exemption determinations must be made by the staff at the Office for Research Protection. So no investigator at Penn State can make an exemption determination on their own. They can't look at this, they can't compare it to the federal regulations and say, I don't need review because I'm exempt, okay? Under the new rule, the same is true, except that there are a few categories of exemption that also require what they've called a limited IRB review. And in this limited IRB review, a single staff member or IRB member must determine that the appropriate privacy and confidentiality provisions are in place. So let's imagine that we are collecting data, for example, via a survey from participants, and that survey collects identifiable information that is also sensitive. So it may pose some sort of risk to the person. My best example is I'm collecting your name and I'm also collecting information on maybe illegal drug use or something like that, and that information is connected. That's where this particular provision would come into play. So we could determine that that would be exempt if that's all they were doing is surveying you, collecting that information. However, we need that one IRB member to do what's called the limited IRB review and determine that those confidentiality and privacy provisions are in place and appropriate to move forward. Okay. So I'll go through some of the changes in the exemptions. Again, if you're familiar, here's where I'll highlight some things that are different. And this may affect your research in a positive way. It could affect your research in a negative way, depending on whether the category has become more restrictive. So for instance, in exempt category 1, which is largely used for a lot of our educational research at Penn State, we didn't have to do this before, but IRB members and staff who are making an exemption determination now have to consider the adverse effects that the research might have on student learning of required educational content or on the assessment of an educator. So we cannot determine to be something exempt if we look at that and think that there would be some sort of adverse effect on student learning or of assessment of the educator. Exempt number 2, some things that have changed. There is some clarification that this category, again, only involves surveys or interviews or educational tests. It does not, you're not allowed to involve things like interventions. So you can't have an intervention and then a survey and determine that to be exempt under that category 2, okay? Can't involve interventions, can't involve collection of biospecimens. And I think, our practice was that we never really did those things at all, but I think, again, this is just a clarification. It can't involve any linking to other available information about an individual or existing private identifiable information. And it cannot involve children as participants except for educational tests and limited public observations. Some of the studies that involve the collection, again, this is the example that I had just given you, the collection of identifiable sensitive data previously could not be determined to be exempt. So that meant that we had to bump it up to the next review level, okay? But now, again, with that limited IRB review provision, we can make that exemption determination. And I understand how confusing that probably is for me to say that to you, because it's taken me quite some time to digest the fact that this is something that doesn't require IRB review or full-blown IRB review, but does require some sort of IRB review to be able to be determined to be exempt, okay? And you're looking at me like I have 8 heads, and I totally understand why, because I'm really not sure why they decided to do that in that final rule, why they didn't create a whole separate category for this sort of thing. But I guess they just decided it was better to just confuse the heck out of people, okay? So under exempt 3, so there was a previous exempt 3 that also had to do with surveys and interviews of public officials. They have now completely done away with that category, and that was fine because really that was something that we didn't use very often anyway. And they have added a brand new category. And that category is for things that they've called benign behavioral interventions, okay? So here's what a benign behavioral intervention has to be, and you'll see how subjective some of these can be. So they have to be brief in duration. So what does that mean? Does that mean 1 hour, 1 day, 1 week? Your guess is as good as mine. We have not come up with a common interpretation of this, though our staff has generally discussed what we would consider to be brief. But I think this is something over time that we'll have to see how this pans out and how institutions choose to interpret this. Not physically invasive, harmless and painless. So harmless, that's, again, how do you easily determine that something is harmless? Not offensive or embarrassing. This is one of the hardest pieces for me in this category, I think, because I think we can all recognize that, that varies from person to person, what they would consider to be offensive or embarrassing. And so really we're going to be looking at the population that you're proposing to involve in the research and whether those things that you want to do might be offensive or embarrassing to that particular population. And not likely to have an adverse lasting impact on participants. So again, questions here tend to be, what is lasting? So again, if they're upset when they walk out of the room, is that okay as long as it's not some permanent lasting effect, or is that not okay? And these are all the things that over time our team, as we start to receive these things starting in July and work on our interpretation, we'll come up with some standards of how we interpret things, just as we have under the current common rule. And hopefully there will be some guidance from OHRP on some of these things, though usually that tends to come very slowly. So I can only hope at this point that we'd have something by then. So information under this category must be collected. So it must be all of those things, but then they additionally say that information must be collected via verbal or written communication. And that includes data entry into a computer or a task on a computer by the participant and or by observation of a participant. So this category, by saying that, they're saying it cannot involve data collected through things like physical sensors. And so the category can't include, if you're just having people walk for a short period of time, but you want them to wear a Fitbit or a heart rate monitor or something like that, that does not fit under this category because they are not providing information via verbal or written communication or data entry. It's a measure of some sort of activity, okay? And then lastly, on this slide, must obtain the prospective agreement from subjects. So this doesn't have to be informed consent in the traditional sense. So you don't have to have this long form that explains all of these things, but you do have to have some acknowledgement by the participant that they are agreeing before they participate in the study. So this could be as simple as, I want to do this with you. Do you want to do this? Or it could be a much more involved process of obtaining that agreement. So they also talk in Exempt 3 about studies involving deception. So deception is typically where you're misleading a subject, maybe about the purpose or the nature of the research. So this happens a lot in psychological research. Maybe they really want to look at particular factors that may influence somebody's decisions, but they don't want to tell that individual that they're actually looking at those factors. So they usually want to be a little more vague in the purpose or the nature that they tell the participant about. So as long as the subject prospectively agrees, again, and is understood and understands through that agreement that they are going to be misled or will be unaware of the purpose of the research, true purpose of the research or true nature of the research, then this type of study, again, can be considered exempt under Category 3. And typically this is also a situation then where some sort of debriefing with participants will happen following that participation in the research. So again, with this category, we also have the same ability to allow studies where they might be collecting sensitive information that is also identifiable, as long as we do that limited IRB review that I mentioned in the last slide and determine that there are appropriate privacy and confidentiality provisions in place to protect the participant and their data.
Sarah, if I can.
Yeah.
I think one of the important things that you as researchers can help us with, when Sarah had talked about, that the benign behavioral interventions must be all of these things, harmless, painless, not offensive or embarrassing. When you're writing your protocol for us and describing your subject population, so if your inclusion criteria just says anybody over the age of 18, then we're looking at the whole general population and whether or not those things apply. But if you're looking at a specific group of people, or we're doing something with this tribal group and stuff, that is going to give us a lot of the information that we need. So you as the researchers, if you can give us that information, that also helps in that determination for what we need to find here in this category.
Okay, and to round out some changes to exemption categories, we have changes to exempt category 4. So previously, exempt category 4 did allow for the use of existing data, so not data that you were going to prospectively collect, but existing data where the information would either be publicly available to the investigator or they would be recording the information without identifiers. So my best example might be if you were going to somebody's existing records, like a student record or something like that, and recording information without identifiers. It is possible that something like that could have been exempt for. Now in student records, we have other issues that involve other regulations covering that sort of thing. For medical records, we have other regulations that cover medical records. But any sort of existing data, if that was being recorded without identifiable information by the investigator. So the idea is when the investigator analyzes the data, they wouldn't have been able to connect that back to an individual, okay? So there have been extensive revisions to this particular category. And this now is written to cover secondary use of identifiable data for which consent is not required. And the reasons that they've built in, or the particular provisions that they've built in, are situations where we would regularly have probably waived informed consent under previous review scenarios. But again, now they've made those able to be determined to be exempt. So this no longer applies only to previously existing data. They took out that provision that it has to be existing data. And then it must meet one of the following criteria. So we're still talking about existing data, but we're talking about data that either the data or specimens are publicly available, so they left that piece in there. That information is recorded in such a manner that subjects cannot be identified, and that there will be no re-identification of the subjects and no contact with subjects. So they added those provisions. Not only does it have to be de-identified, but you're not ever going to try to re-identify or contact those subjects for anything, okay? The third part is that the research, and it has to be one of these, okay? So it must meet one of these criteria. The research involves only information collection and analysis involving investigators' use of identifiable health information that is covered under HIPAA. So again, these things were previously not reviewed or not determined to be exempt, but had to be reviewed at a different review level. This still requires that a HIPAA privacy board review and waiver of authorization be made if appropriate. And I won't go into the weeds about that because I think it's just a little too complicated for our overview today. But the last piece is any research that is conducted by or on behalf of a federal department or agency using government-generated or government-collected information that has been obtained for non-research activities. So maybe the CDC, if they're doing some sort of like public health awareness or public health study or something like that, they may be able to collect that information that they've been collecting for other purposes and use that under this category. So it's not something that we probably are typically going to see here, given that we are not a federal agency conducting research. So the second key change that we're going to go over a little bit is informed consent requirements. So this is going to be an investigator-facing requirement, if I might. So this is going to be something where you're going to notice some difference. If you've used our consent templates in the past, you'll notice that there are some differences to the templates that we'll publish in July of this year. So we've got some new requirements in those informed consent forms. And the first is that the informed consent forms have to include a concise and focused presentation of key information at the beginning of the consent form or beginning of the consent process, okay? That key information section should include things like information that the research and participation in the research is voluntary. It should include a summary, a brief summary of the research procedures, and information about the risks to participating and the benefits of participating, okay? There are some consent forms, so some of you may be going, oh my gosh, well, if I had to move all of this information to the forefront of this form, that's my entire consent form. hence my next point, is in some social behavioral research in particular, the consent form probably already meets this requirement because you probably don't have really lengthy explanations for some things. You probably don't have much more information than what I've covered there. And so what we'd be looking for in those sort of situations is, again, in using our template, moving some of that information to the beginning of the consent form, not creating this whole separate section. But for lengthier consent forms, for more complicated studies, we'd be looking to create this separate section called the key information. The idea behind this was to, there's some research saying that after a certain point, research participants sort of check out. And so I think we all do this, right? So how many of you have started to read the terms and use of something that you're using, whether it be a new app or, you know, iTunes or whatever it might be, and you start looking at it and going, yep, that looks good. That's what we don't want research participants to do. And consent forms have gotten so long and so complicated and contain so many legalese statements and language that most participants report in research that they are not reading the entire form, nor do they comprehend some of the information that is really important, like the risks to them in participating in that particular study. So the idea is to summarize this stuff, move it to the forefront so that they hear the important information and can digest that before they move on to the rest of the form. So some additional required elements that were not required previously and will be part of our templates is you now must indicate what will happen to data or specimens after the research study. And so there must be a statement, one of these must be included, so an indication that de-identified information or specimens may be used for future undetermined research. This is something that wasn't part of informed consent forms before and that people have been doing for ages. But the idea now is, out of respect for participants, we want them to know that even if their information is de-identified, we're going to use it for future studies, or we will not use it for future studies. Then when future studies are proposed, what the IRB will say is, let me see the informed consent form for that previous study so that we may determine whether it would be appropriate for this information to be used for this future study that's being proposed. Okay? So then there are a few statements, and that's in all informed consent forms. Now there are a few statements that will only be included when they are applicable to that particular study. So when you're collecting biospecimens, information about whether biospecimens will be used for commercial profit and whether the subject will share in that profit, whether any clinically relevant results will be returned to the subject. So for instance, if you were doing some standard measure, if you were doing an MRI or something like that, will any of those results be returned to the subject for their own use or their own information? And then when the research involves whole genome sequencing, there must be, again, be information in the consent form indicating that. So some other notable requirements are that we now have the ability to, the criteria for waiving informed consent for secondary use of data or specimens has changed a little bit and now includes a justification for the use of identifiable information. So previously, if you proposed to use identifiable information, we didn't ask that question. We didn't ask you to justify why you need identifiable information. But now we must do that. And the idea, again, is why would an investigator use identifiable information if it's possible for them to use de-identified information instead and further protect those particular subjects from which the data or specimens came? Okay. So also, there's a definition of clinical trials. So again, this gets confusing because NIH also has some things going on with clinical trials and has their own definition of clinical trials. The definitions in the proposed common rule that'll come out in July and also the NIH are very much the same. And in fact, we interpret them to mean the same. Excuse me. However, the requirements that are attached to a study that meets that definition for NIH or under this common rule are very different, okay? And so under the common rule that we're talking about today, if a study meets the definition of a clinical trial, then the investigators were required to post one informed consent form that was used to enroll subjects to a publicly available federally established website. Now, I think, you know, we can speculate on why this rule was delayed, but I think one of those reasons that factored into this was we didn't know where at this point. They hadn't told us where we'd be posting these consent forms, how we'd be doing that. We had no information on how to carry this out and comply with that regulation. And so I hope by the time that this comes in July, that we will then know where it is that investigators will be required to post a copy of their informed consent form. And I included the definition of clinical trial there, though we don't need to specifically go over that today, but again, very similar between NIH and the common rule. Okay, so those are the informed consent form changes. And the last piece is about this concept of broad consent. So this is a really complicated concept, but it was an optional provision, and they wrote that way in the rule, an optional provision that provided an alternative to the current mechanisms for obtaining informed consent for the future use of data and specimens, particularly identifiable data and specimens. So the idea here, I think, in theory, was that maybe a subject could walk through the door at a hospital for treatment, okay? And that the hospital could have a process by which they obtain broad consent for the future use of specimens and data that are collected during that person's treatment at that particular facility, okay? Now, what that requires is a very complex system. So if you can imagine, like, you might go to the hospital once, not return to the hospital again for 3 years. If you were asked, you know, day one when you came through the door, is your answer going to be the same as, you know, the next time you walk to that hospital facility door? So there's a lot of complication there in this process. And unfortunately, a lack of guidance at this point from OHRP. So this is not something that we planned as Penn State IRBs to implement at this time. In fact, you know, on a large scale, there may not have really been any benefits to us doing that here at our campus and those other campus locations. However, again, this would certainly be something that would be advantageous for medical facilities and things like that to implement. But we've decided that we were not going to implement this provision, given that the tracking of that informed consent would be very difficult, and the situation was just very complicated to determine how to appropriately comply. So that's something you wouldn't have had to worry about anyway. So the third key change is elimination of continuing review. And if you've had an approved study, if you've had to do annual or continuing reviews, you're probably like, yay, this would be fantastic. And generally, it would have been fantastic. And come July, I hope that we will have the same rule, and that we'll be able to reap the benefits of that. You know, studies that are no longer requiring continuing review. So the types of studies for which continuing review would not be required under the new rule would be studies that were eligible for expedited review. So that is generally studies that were no more than minimal risk to subjects. Studies that were determined to be exempt with the limited IRB review. And then also studies that may have been greater than minimal risk when they originated, but that have progressed to the point that the remaining research activities would be limited to data analysis, even if that was identifiable data or specimens that you were analyzing, or accessing follow-up clinical care data or other sort of data from standard procedures that would be happening with the participant regardless of the research. Okay, so under those scenarios. So there are very few scenarios, and I can explain one clearly. So say you had a study that was determined, that went to the full committee, was determined to be more than minimal risk, and you are continuing to enroll subjects. In that scenario, you do have to complete a continuing review each year until your studies progress to the point that you're just in that phase of data analysis. Okay? So investigators at Penn State would still be required to submit the following types of things, even when a continuing review wasn't required. So you have to submit any modifications to your protocol or to the approved research to our office for review. You would have to submit reportable new information, so any adverse events that would need to be reported to the IRB for consideration and review, breaches of confidentiality, those sort of things. So those are not exempt from that process. And then also a study closure when appropriate. So we would really want to know when you're done doing the study so that we can sort of get that off of our books and know that it no longer requires those other reports. We have determined that with a lack of continuing review, we will still have an annual check-in, if you will, where we will ask investigators about the status of the study so that we know whether the study is still active and we can, again, take that off the books if necessary. And what would happen is if the investigator didn't reply to that particular notice within a given time or check-in with a given time, we would then close out the study. Okay? So the last provision, and again, I had mentioned before that this was the only provision that was not supposed to go live on January 19th. So this already was not supposed to go live until January of 2020. And that is still true. That is still the effective date for this particular provision. And that is single IRB review for cooperative research. So again, that's not to be confused with NIH policy. So I'm not going to go into depth here because we're not here to talk about the NIH policy and the changes, but there is an NIH policy for single IRB review of multi-site research that does go into effect for grant proposals or applications that are submitted on or after January 25th of this year. So under that policy, that talks about multi-site research. So a multi-site study is a study where each participating institution, so hypothetically an institution that has their own IRB, is carrying out the same exact research protocol, the same methodologies, all of the same things at each site that's participating, or more than one site that's participating, okay? In a cooperative research setting, this would be where maybe you have some collaborators at another institution or more than one institution, where maybe you are doing this piece of the research, but your colleague over there will do that piece of the research. So you're not carrying out that same exact protocol at more than one site. That's what we're talking about with cooperative research. So really this requirement is actually more broad than what the NIH policy covers right now. It would apply to domestic sites only, so not foreign sites that are participating. And also, again, requires that the research is reviewed by a single IRB with limited exceptions. So when we talk about IRB review, we're talking about the ethical or regulatory review under the regulations that we've been talking about today, this common rule, okay? We're not talking about all the other pieces that you may need to complete at Penn State to get a study started. So you may have other reviews at the university. You might have to have a contracts review. You might have to go through OSP for your award. You might have to, if you were collecting specimens, you might have to go through the Institutional Biosafety Committee. You would still need to do all of those things. The only part that would be done by one IRB is that ethical or regulatory review for the human subjects piece. And that we would be largely helping you to coordinate with another institution. So transition and recommendation. So this would have been much more important had this rule been going forth tomorrow. And I'm sure people really would have wanted to know that more. But we do have a website where we are keeping information about the common rule. So right now we just updated that, I think last night or early this morning, to say, guess what, there's been this delay to July, but we have other general information there, and we're pointing you to other changes via that particular website, the Common Rule Changes website. So for the new provisions that I just discussed with you will now be effective for studies submitted on or after July 19th. Okay, but remember that right now, what we know is that they don't apply to FDA and DOJ funded studies, okay? Those provisions don't apply to existing studies. So studies that are approved prior to July 19th will currently be subject to those old common rule provisions. So what we're operating under right now. So any of these changes that we just discussed today will never be applied unless we decide otherwise sometime down the road to your studies that you've got ongoing right now or that you'll do before July. So you want to keep an eye out in CATS IRB for updated toolkit documents. We will have new protocol templates that address some of these new requirements and collect this new information. We'll have new informed consent templates that include the statements and sections that I discussed with you today. We'll have updated SOPs that guide how we review those particular studies under the new regulations. Also, if you're not familiar, we do have something called the Investigator Manual. Investigator Manual is a really good resource for investigators. It explains the types of approvals that you need for some things. It explains when you do and do not need to submit modifications for different types of research. It also goes through what your responsibilities are as an investigator. And those apply to you as well if you're a graduate student or undergraduate student who's conducting research. Those same things apply to you if you are the principal investigator. Though in that situation, you would also have a faculty advisor listed on the study who shares in that responsibility, essentially. And we have other information, release notes in CATS IRB that sort of walk you through some of the changes at a higher level that will be made to the system. And we also have an area where we provide all of our IRB's contact information should you have questions or need help in the system. Those are also available there in the Help Center. So, we have about 15 minutes left. If there's anybody in particular that is interested in NIH policy updates, I can talk about those, as I do have a couple of slides on them that I prepared just in case. But otherwise, I'd be happy to take any questions that you have about this delay, about the common rule in general. If you happen to have any general human subjects questions that the group might benefit from, I'd be happy to answer those, and also any remote questions that we might have.
You mentioned about the single IRB that Penn State IRB would help us get in touch with the other IRB.
Mm-hmm.
So certain investigators at other places don't necessarily know who their IRB contact is or what they need from us. So you would help facilitate that.
Absolutely. So if you find yourself in a situation, and right now that would only be under the NIH policy right now, okay, until 2020. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're applying for an NIH grant and you know that that single IRB policy is going to apply, or you think that it might apply, actually Jody, it's convenient that she's here today, but she is going to be our main contact for those single IRB questions. So she'd be able to help answer those questions, help you determine whether the policy does in fact apply. If maybe we're not the lead institution, but we're a sub-awardee, we'd be able to help you through that process of connecting with that IRB. But much of that talk goes on from IRB to IRB. Sometimes investigators are involved, but it kind of has to be raised to that higher level so that we can discuss the nitty-gritty of which IRB will be the reviewing IRB, if you will. So absolutely, if you ever find yourself in that situation, the first thing I'd say is contact us, because we're going to want to help walk you through what needs to be done.
And that all has to be determined before you submit the grant proposal to NIH.
Right.
So, you don't want to, you want to keep that in mind as you're developing the grant and proposal and the budget, is that these agreements have to be in place before you submit, because NIH wants to know who's going to be the single IRB and what your plan is.
Other questions?
No one.
Anything else that I can answer? Any burning human subjects questions? Okay. Well, I think we can probably be done then. Is that okay, Deb?
Sure.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for coming.
Welcome. Thank you.
Don't forget to pick up a sorry event flyer if you would like to take one with you.